everyone, my name is Masha and today I'm going to share 5 tips or hacks about alpha bracelets. So if you've never made alpha patterns before and you want to learn from the beginning, I have a very detailed tutorial on that. I'll leave that in the card and in the description down below. Today's video is more for people who actually know how to make alphas, and I'm going to give you just some extra tips about them. So the first thing you might have already heard me talk about, and that is keeping your alpha bracelets straight at the edges. Let me show you what I mean. So this is a bracelet that I made without using the straight edges technique. And as you can see, the edges are slightly bumpy. You can see little ridges on each of them. You can sort of see how the string waves there and back, and then at the edge you can see that wave coming to a form. And there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people make their bracelets like that and they look beautiful. But if you want your alphas to have more of a straight edge, there is a way to do that also. And here is an example of an alpha that I made where I kept the edges straight. As you can see, there are no bumps on the edges and the edges are much straighter. So the way to do this is actually very simple. So normally when you're making a bracelet with the bumpy edges, you just make a row of backward knots, switching all the strings for each of the colours as you need, but you just make backward knots even for the edge string, and then on the next row you go and make forward knots for all of the strings, switching the colours again as you need for the pattern, but all of them are forward knots. If you want to keep your edges straight, however, for the edge strings, for the left edge string you're always going to do backward forward knots, and for the right edge string you're always going to do forward backward knots. And what I mean by that is for each row. So for the row that you would normally here just do backward knots. So for this new technique, for example, if you were doing backward knots, you would start with doing a forward backward knot on the right edge string, then go all the way to the left through the center strings in backward knots. Then on the left edge string you would do a backward forward knot. Then to start off with the second row, you would again do another backward forward knot on that edge string, and do all the center strings in forward knots, and then the one on the right you would do a forward backward knot. And then again for the next row you would do another forward backward knot, go all the way through the center, and then do a backward forward knot on the left. So for each of the edge strings, for the one on the left you do backward forward knots all the time, and for the one on the right you do forward backward knots. The reason this doesn't result in bumps is because your strings are always inside of the bracelet. The edge strings act as edges. Your strings never go beyond that point. They always return in that backward forward knot. So another tip for keeping your bracelets straighter and neater. Always try to use strings or yarn that produce the same size knots, because you want all your knots to be nice and neat, the same size, so your rows are consistent, the width of the bracelet is consistent, and it doesn't go all wonky and mess up your bracelet. The best way to do this is to use the same exact brand of string. That's the 100% sure way method of getting the strings the same exact thickness. But personally I can never achieve that. I always tend to mix my strings. But for that you have to be very careful, and you have to keep track of what size knots all your strings produce. Now you could do a test run, cut a little bit of each string and test it out, see what size knots they produce. For example, I know that this yarn that I've got yarn Captions, which is just a cotton yarn that I got in Russia. I know that this produces pretty large knots. The yarn is a little thicker than usual, and I know from experience this produces pretty big knots for me. So unless I'm using all of the strings from the brand Captions, I'm probably not going to use it in making an alpha, because then the knots will be inconsistent. On the other hand, I've got this yarn, which is Anchor. I have no idea how to pronounce that, but that is what the tag says. And also because I know you guys are going to ask, this is the color number. I know that this guy produces really tiny knots because the string is much thinner than normal embroidery floss. So again, I probably won't be using this in an alpha unless I can use it with the same type of string. So try to use strings from the same brand. But if you're like me and you can never get yourself to do that, just make sure that you test out your strings by cutting little bits and pieces of it and making some knots with it to make sure that the knots are all consistent in size. So there are many different ways that you can start your alpha bracelet, and I even have a whole playlist full of tutorials on how to start and finish your bracelets, including alphas as well. But sometimes I don't want to make a special start. Sometimes I just want to start my bracelet without any fuss. Sometimes, like in this bracelet, I just want to go in with a straight edge. If I start with a straight edge, I can then go back and make braided ties on each of the ends. What I'm going to describe now also works if you want to attach crimp ends, which are sort of like clasps for your bracelets. I have a tutorial on how to attach them as well that will be linked. But basically what you do is you literally just tape your strings to the table. You want to leave some string for the top so that you can go back and make those ties. And even if you're attaching crimps and you're going to cut those strings off eventually, you still want to leave some strings for the top because it just helps keep your bracelet in place. I usually leave around 15 centimeters. You might want to leave a little bit less, a little bit more, depending on what size ties you want to make. But I personally think that leaving a little bit more is best because, first of all, it gives you extra room if you decide to make your ties a little bit longer. And second of all, it really does help keep your bracelet pinned down if you have more strings to work with. And I usually use a lot of tape. So if I leave about 15 centimeters of string, that is how much I'm going to be taping down to the table. And you really want to spread your strings out so sort of each of the strings individually is covered by tape all along its length. That helps keep it secure. Now this isn't 100% foolproof, so when you're making your first row you still want to be quite careful to make sure that you're not pulling on any strings, but it definitely helps. So another thing that I want to talk about is making sure that you don't get lost within your row. So when you're looking at a design, it can be really confusing. You've isolated the row that you're working with. What do you do now? I personally find it helpful to sit down and count how many knots do you need to make of the first color. And before I start actually making them, I'm going to go ahead and separate those strings. So right now I'm making this pattern, for example, and I'm on row 39. So I can see that I need to make 4 knots of the background color. So I'm going to separate 4 base strings before I start making my knots. So that way I don't get carried away when I'm actually making the knots and make too many, because untying knots is a pain that takes much longer than actually tying them. And then same for all the other colors. You count out how many knots you need to make, you separate those strings, and then you make the knots. That has saved me multiple times because especially when I have large blocks of color, I tend to get really carried away while I'm knotting because I'm usually listening to an audiobook or watching a TV show and I don't notice what I'm doing that much. And last but not least, let's talk about how to center your design. So when I have a design that I want to be in the center, like on the bracelet that I'm making right now, so when I'm making a bracelet where I need to center a design, I know that the beginning and the end is probably just going to consist of background rows. So I first sit down and I make about a centimeter of just background rows. I take my ruler and I make sure that that is exactly a centimeter, and then I count how many rows that was. For me personally, in this bracelet, that is 6 rows. So I know that the way I knot, I make 6 rows per centimeter. You then decide how long you want your bracelet to be. I tend to make my bracelets around 14 centimeters long. Next, you're going to count how many rows the design takes up. So for me, my design is from row 25 to row 70. So it takes up 45 rows. Now I know that I make 6 rows per centimeter, so 45 I need to divide by 6 to figure out how long that will be. And that leaves me with 7.5 centimeters. So the design itself is going to be 7.5 centimeters long. I want my entire bracelet to be about 14 centimeters. So for the background rows at the start and the background rows at the end together is going to be 14 minus 7.5, which is 6.5. That was combined, so 6.5 divided by 2, and that leaves you with 325. Now you might want to round that number up or down a little bit, either to 3 or to 3.5. I'm going to round it up, say 3.5. That is the length of the background rows, so you're going to have 3.5 centimeters, then you're going to have 7.5 for the actual design, and then 3.5 again at the end. So 3.5 centimeters, you multiply that by 6, which is the number of rows per centimeter you have, which happens to be 21. So that means you have to make 21 rows until you start your design. And there you go, you figured out what you need to make. So make sure you also make the same number of rows at the end when you finished your design, and then your design will be centered. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope some of these hacks were helpful. Before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my patrons and especially my top supporters, who are Zoe, Simon, Tia, Orlin, Misty, Sydney, Lara, Anna, Gretchen and Izzy. Thank you guys so much for your support. I really truly appreciate it. If you also want to become a patron, there is a link in the description where you can sign up and get Patreon exclusive perks. I recently hit 30 patrons, which is the number that I promised I would run a competition at. So I'm starting to run a patron specific bracelet competition, and at the end of this competition, one of my patrons will win a bracelet from me. If you want to take part in that, there's still time to sign up for that. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I post videos on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and also sometimes bonus videos in between, so keep your eyes out for that, and I'll see you next time. Bye!